There was a time when respect for family was considered inviolable, when crossing certain lines in humor was universally understood to be unacceptable, and when attacking someone's loved ones rather than engaging with them directly was recognized as cowardice dressed as wit. But what happened on Family Feud in June 2025 would test these boundaries in the most personal way imaginable. When 28-year-old Jordan Mitchell made a comment about Steve Harvey's family that crossed from playful banter into cruel mockery, he set in motion a confrontation that would force both men to reckon with questions about humor, respect, and the invisible lines that separate entertainment from genuine harm. What unfolded in those next 20 minutes would leave the audience uncomfortable and uncertain, Steve Harvey demonstrating restraint that belied his visible anger, and millions of viewers reconsidering where the boundaries of acceptable humor should be drawn when family becomes the target. Before we continue with this powerful story, if you value moments that challenge us to defend what matters most and demonstrate the importance of protecting family dignity, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you the Family Feud moments that go beyond entertainment to explore fundamental questions about respect, boundaries, and what we owe to the people we love most. Jordan Mitchell had spent 6 years building a career as a stand-up comedian in the Los Angeles comedy circuit. He had developed a reputation for edgy humor that pushed boundaries and challenged audiences to confront uncomfortable truths through laughter. Jordan believed deeply in comedy as a tool for social commentary, viewing his work as more than mere entertainment, but as a form of cultural critique that exposed hypocrisy and challenged conventional thinking. His comedy drew heavily on observational humor about public figures, often involving pointed critiques of celebrities and their public personas that he viewed as fair game for satirical treatment. Jordan's approach to comedy had been shaped by his training in improvisational theater and his immersion in a comedy culture that valued shock and transgression as artistic virtues. He had studied comedians who built careers on saying the unsayable, who gained notoriety by crossing lines that others respected, and who defended their most offensive material as necessary provocation in service of artistic truth. Jordan had internalized a philosophy that essentially any topic could be made funny if approached with sufficient cleverness, that offense was subjective and therefore not a valid constraint on artistic expression, and that people who objected to provocative humor were simply too unsophisticated to appreciate its satirical intent. What Jordan had not fully developed alongside his comedic skills was wisdom about context, audience, and the difference between punching up at powerful institutions and punching down at vulnerable individuals. He had convinced himself that all public figures, by virtue of their visibility and success, were equally valid targets for mockery regardless of the specific nature of that mockery or its potential to cause genuine harm. Jordan believed that his role as a comedian gave him license to say things that would be inappropriate in other contexts, that the stage or the spotlight created a kind of protected space where normal rules of respect and decency could be suspended in service of getting a laugh. Jordan's girlfriend Rachel had tried to help him understand that there were meaningful distinctions between different types of humor, that satirizing someone's public actions was fundamentally different from mocking their family or personal tragedies, and that the intent to be funny did not erase the impact of genuinely hurtful comments. But Jordan had dismissed her concerns as overcaution born from not understanding comedy culture. He believed that comedy required courage to say difficult things, and that self-censorship in the name of sensitivity would undermine the art form's capacity to challenge and provoke. Jordan had gathered his family for this Family Feud appearance as part of a promotional strategy for his comedy career. He viewed the show as a platform to demonstrate his quick wit and comedic timing to a national audience, potentially opening doors to larger opportunities in television and entertainment. The Mitchell family consisted of Jordan, his girlfriend Rachel, his brother Kyle, his sister-in-law Amanda, and his cousin Derek. They had prepared for the show by watching episodes and identifying opportunities for humor, with Jordan specifically planning to treat the appearance as an extended comedic performance rather than a straightforward game show participation. What Jordan did not anticipate was that his approach to humor which worked in comedy clubs where audiences selected based on appreciation for edgy material, would translate very differently on a family game show where the rules of engagement were fundamentally different. He did not recognize that Steve Harvey's willingness to engage in playful banter with contestants did not constitute permission to launch personal attacks on his family. He did not understand that the context of Family Feud created expectations and boundaries that his comedy club experience had not prepared him to respect. Most critically, Jordan did not realize that his comment would cross a line that would transform Steve Harvey from genial host into protective father and husband, triggering a response that would teach Jordan harsh lessons about the difference between comedy and cruelty. The Mitchell family had performed well through the first 2 rounds, demonstrating good chemistry and strong gameplay that kept them competitive with the opposing family. Jordan had been injecting humor into his interactions with Steve Harvey, making quick jokes and playful comments that initially seemed to add entertainment value to the broadcast. Steve had responded to these moments with his characteristic good humor, engaging in the kind of light-hearted banter that was standard for the show and that audiences enjoyed. The 3rd round arrived and Jordan was at the podium for the face-off question. The back and forth between Jordan and Steve had continued, with Jordan making increasingly bold attempts at humor that were beginning to shift from playful to pointed. Steve's responses had become slightly more reserved, his laughter less genuine, as he began to sense that Jordan's approach to the interaction was different from typical contestant banter. After Jordan gave his answer to the face-off question, he made an additional comment that he clearly intended as a joke building on the comedic rapport he believed he had established with Steve. Looking directly at Steve with a smile that suggested he was about to deliver a punchline, Jordan said something that crossed every line of acceptable humor. The specific content of Jordan's comment referenced Steve Harvey's well-known blended family, made implications about the circumstances of Steve's divorce and remarriage, and suggested dysfunction in Steve's household using language that was both disrespectful and intentionally provocative. The comment was delivered in the tone of a roast, as though Jordan believed the context of lighthearted game show banter gave him permission to make deeply personal observations about Steve's family relationships. The studio audience's reaction was immediate and visceral. The laughter that had accompanied Jordan's previous jokes was replaced by audible gasps and uncomfortable silence. People looked at each other in shock, uncertain whether they had actually heard what they thought they had heard. Jordan's own family members showed expressions of alarm and dismay, clearly recognizing that he had said something that went far beyond appropriate bounds. Steve Harvey's transformation was instant and complete. The genial smile that had characterized his interaction with Jordan vanished, replaced by an expression of controlled fury that everyone present immediately recognized as dangerous. Steve stood completely still for several seconds, processing what had just been said about his family on national television. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried an intensity that made the entire studio fall silent. The confrontation that followed would become one of the most discussed moments in Family Feud history, not because it involved shouting or dramatic gestures, but because it demonstrated the power of controlled anger and measured response in the face of genuine provocation. Steve set down his cards with careful deliberation and walked directly to where Jordan stood at the podium. His movement was slow and purposeful, giving Jordan time to recognize the gravity of what was about to happen. When Steve spoke, every word was chosen with precision and delivered with unmistakable authority. He began by addressing Jordan directly in a voice that everyone in the studio could hear clearly despite its quiet intensity. He stated that there were boundaries in humor that should never be crossed. That family was off limits regardless of the context or the claimed comedic intent, and that Jordan had just violated those boundaries in a way that demanded immediate response and consequence. Steve explained that he had built his career on humor and understood better than most people the role that comedy played in entertainment and social commentary. He acknowledged that public figures like himself opened themselves to scrutiny and satire by choosing careers in the spotlight. He recognized that playful banter and light-hearted teasing were part of the Family Feud experience, and that he actively encouraged contestants to have fun and show personality during their appearances. But Steve made clear that what Jordan had done was fundamentally different from any of those acceptable forms of humor. Jordan had not made a joke about Steve's hosting style or his fashion choices or his public persona. Jordan had attacked Steve's family, had made insulting implications about Steve's marriage and household, and had done so in a way that was designed to humiliate rather than to entertain. Steve's voice remained controlled, but his anger was unmistakable as he addressed the broader principle that Jordan had violated. He spoke about the fact that his wife and children had not chosen to be public figures, that they deserved protection from the kind of attack Jordan had just launched, and that using them as material for jokes was not clever comedy, but cowardice that targeted people who could not defend themselves in the moment. The confrontation continued as Steve challenged Jordan's assumption that being a comedian gave him license to say anything he wanted without regard for impact or appropriateness. He stated that real comedy required intelligence, empathy, and an understanding of context, not just a willingness to say shocking things and claim artistic license when people objected to the harm caused. Jordan attempted to respond, his initial confident demeanor crumbling as he recognized the seriousness of Steve's reaction. He tried to claim that he had been joking, that he meant no real offense, and that Steve was overreacting to what was intended as playful humor in the spirit of the show's light-hearted atmosphere. Steve's response to Jordan's attempted justification was swift and uncompromising. He rejected the claim that intent mattered more than impact, stating that Jordan's intention to be funny did not erase the fact that he had been disrespectful and cruel. He dismissed the suggestion that he was overreacting, pointing out that defending one's family from public attack was not overreaction but appropriate and necessary response. The tension in the studio was extraordinary as everyone present recognized they were witnessing something unprecedented. This was not the scripted drama of reality television, but a genuine confrontation between two men with fundamentally different understandings of boundaries, respect, and the limits of humor. Steve Harvey stood facing Jordan Mitchell, having just dismantled the young comedian's justifications for his inappropriate comment about Steve's family. The moment required Steve to decide not just how to respond to the immediate offense, but what message to send about the broader principles at stake. Steve made a decision that would demonstrate both the strength of his convictions and his capacity for measured judgment, even in the face of personal provocation. He turned to address the studio audience and the cameras, using the moment to articulate principles that extended beyond the specific incident with Jordan. Steve spoke about the responsibility that came with having a platform and a microphone, whether on a comedy stage or a television show. He explained that words had power, that humor could be used to unite or to wound, and that the choice of how to use that power revealed character and values. Steve acknowledged that comedy often involved pushing boundaries, and that some of the most important social commentary came from comedians willing to challenge conventional thinking and expose uncomfortable truths. He stated his respect for comedy as an art form and his appreciation for comedians who used their skills to make people think as well as laugh. But Steve drew a clear distinction between comedy that challenged ideas, institutions, and public personas versus comedy that attacked individuals' families and personal relationships. He explained that there was nothing brave or transgressive about mocking someone's marriage or making implications about their household dysfunction. That kind of humor did not challenge power or expose hypocrisy. It simply caused pain to people who had done nothing to deserve being targeted. Steve then did something that surprised everyone present. Rather than simply disqualifying Jordan and his family from the competition, which would have been completely justified given the severity of the offense, Steve created an opportunity for genuine accountability and potential learning. He offered Jordan a choice. Jordan could apologize genuinely and specifically for what he had said, acknowledging that he had crossed a line and demonstrating understanding of why his comment was inappropriate. If Jordan did this, Steve would allow the family to continue competing, though the offensive exchange would be edited from the broadcast. Alternatively, Jordan could maintain his position that Steve was overreacting and that his comment was acceptable humor, in which case the family would be asked to leave immediately and the entire confrontation would air unedited so that viewers could judge for themselves whether Jordan's behavior had been appropriate. The choice Steve presented to Jordan was about more than the immediate consequences. It was about whether Jordan had the humility to recognize when he was wrong, the courage to admit it publicly, and the wisdom to learn from the experience. Steve made clear that the apology had to be genuine, that it had to demonstrate actual understanding of the harm caused, and that it could not include justifications or minimizations of what had occurred. Jordan stood there, his confidence completely stripped away, facing a decision that would reveal his true character. His family members were watching him with expressions that communicated both support and expectation that he would do the right thing. Rachel, his girlfriend, had tears in her eyes and appeared to be silently urging him to apologize. When Jordan finally spoke, his voice had lost all traces of the cocky humor that had characterized his earlier interactions. He began with an apology that started as defensive and self-justifying, but gradually transformed into something more genuine as he processed the impact of what Steve had said and what his own family's reactions were communicating. Jordan acknowledged that he had made a comment about Steve's family that was inappropriate and hurtful. He admitted that he had been trying to be funny without considering the impact of his words on real people. He stated that his background in edgy comedy had created blind spots about context and boundaries, and that he had failed to recognize that Family Feud was not a comedy club where anything goes. Steve listened to Jordan's apology with an expression that remained serious and unconvinced. When Jordan finished, Steve asked him a direct question that cut to the heart of whether the apology was genuine. He asked Jordan whether he understood why attacking someone's family was different from other forms of humor, or whether he was simply apologizing because he had been caught and confronted. Jordan's response to this challenge would determine everything that followed. He took a moment before answering, and when he spoke again, there was a quality of genuine reflection that had been absent from his initial apology. He stated that he had spent years believing that being funny justified saying almost anything, that getting a laugh was the ultimate validation of his comedic choices, and that people who objected to edgy humor were simply too sensitive to appreciate its value. But standing there facing Steve's anger and his own family's disappointment, Jordan said he was beginning to understand that he had been wrong about fundamental aspects of how humor worked and what responsibilities came with the power to make people laugh or cause them pain. He acknowledged that he had caused Steve genuine hurt by attacking his family, that this hurt was not negated by his claim to comedic intent, and that he needed to fundamentally reconsider his approach to comedy if he wanted to be someone whose humor brought more light than darkness into the world. Steve listened to this more reflective response, and his expression began to soften slightly. He acknowledged that Jordan's second attempt at apology showed more genuine understanding than the first. He stated that everyone made mistakes, and that the measure of character was not whether you failed, but whether you learned from failure and committed to doing better. Steve made a decision that reflected both justice and mercy. He accepted Jordan's apology and allowed the family to continue competing. However, he stated clearly that the entire exchange, including Jordan's offensive comment and the subsequent confrontation, would air as part of the episode, because hiding it would deny viewers the opportunity to see both the violation and the accountability that followed. Steve explained that he was making this choice because he believed that public mistakes deserved public accountability, that showing the full arc from offense to apology had educational value, and that Jordan's visible struggle to move from defensive justification to genuine understanding might help other people recognize similar blind spots in their own behavior. The game continued with a fundamentally different dynamic than had existed before the confrontation. Jordan participated quietly and respectfully, his earlier attempts at humor completely abandoned in favor of straightforward gameplay. His family members engaged with the competition, but with visible awareness that something significant had occurred that could not be easily dismissed or forgotten. When the episode aired 8 weeks later, it included the complete unedited confrontation with careful framing about boundaries, respect, and the limits of humor. The network received extensive debate internally about whether to broadcast such a personal and uncomfortable exchange, but ultimately agreed with Steve's reasoning that the full context from offense through accountability had value that justified the discomfort it would create. The response was immediate, divided, and intense. Many viewers praised Steve Harvey for defending his family and for refusing to allow Jordan's comment to be dismissed as harmless humor. Parents across the country used the clip to discuss with their children about the difference between appropriate jokes and hurtful attacks disguised as comedy. People who had experienced having their families mocked or attacked publicly expressed gratitude for seeing someone with Steve's platform take a clear stand on protecting family dignity. However, significant segments of the comedy community and free speech advocates argued that Steve's confrontation had been disproportionate, that Jordan's comment fell within bounds of acceptable edgy humor, and that the public shaming Jordan experienced represented a troubling trend toward censorship of provocative comedy. Online debates raged about where the line between acceptable satire and inappropriate personal attack should be drawn, with passionate arguments on multiple sides of the question. Jordan Mitchell found himself at the center of this controversy, his Family Feud appearance becoming far more significant to his career than he had anticipated when he made his ill-considered comment. He lost several comedy club bookings from venues that did not want to be associated with someone who had been publicly called out for inappropriate humor. However, he also gained a different kind of attention from people who viewed him as a victim of oversensitivity and who wanted to support comedians willing to push boundaries. Jordan faced a choice about how to respond to the situation and what kind of comedian he wanted to become. He could embrace the narrative that he had been unfairly attacked for doing edgy comedy and build a career around being the comedian who refused to be censored. Alternatively, he could take seriously what Steve Harvey had said about boundaries and responsibility and use the experience to develop a more thoughtful approach to his craft. Jordan chose the latter path, though not immediately and not without significant struggle and reflection. 3 months after the episode aired, he published a detailed essay describing his experience and what he had learned from it. The essay demonstrated genuine grappling with difficult questions about comedy, harm, and the responsibilities that came with the power to influence how people thought and felt through humor. Jordan wrote about how his training in comedy had emphasized transgression and shock value as markers of artistic courage, but had not adequately taught him to distinguish between comedy that challenged power and comedy that simply caused pain to vulnerable individuals. He described his realization that attacking Steve Harvey's family had not been brave social commentary, but lazy cruelty that punched down at people who had no ability to respond or defend themselves in the moment. The essay included Jordan's acknowledgement that his initial apology to Steve had been more about avoiding consequences than genuine understanding, and that it had taken weeks of reflection and conversations with people he trusted to truly grasp why his comment had been so inappropriate. He thanked Steve for creating a moment of accountability that forced him to confront blind spots he might otherwise have carried throughout his career. Jordan's essay resonated with many people in the comedy community who had been wrestling with similar questions about boundaries, context, and the evolution of what audiences expected from humor. Several established comedians praised Jordan for his honesty and his willingness to question assumptions that the comedy world had long taken for granted. Comedy schools and training programs began incorporating discussions of Jordan's Family Feud experience into their curricula as a case study in the importance of understanding context and audience. 6 months after the episode aired, Steve Harvey invited Jordan to appear on his talk show for a follow-up conversation about what had happened and what both men had learned from the experience. The segment provided an opportunity for deeper exploration of the issues that the Family Feud confrontation had raised about humor, family, and respect. During that conversation, Steve explained his thinking in the moment when he had to decide how to respond to Jordan's comment. He described the surge of protective anger he had felt when his family was attacked, the conscious choice he made to respond with controlled intensity rather than explosive rage, and the decision to create an opportunity for accountability rather than simply ending Jordan's participation without explanation. Steve also acknowledged that he had been watching Jordan's evolution since the Family Feud incident, that he had read Jordan's essay with genuine interest, and that he respected the young comedian's willingness to question his own assumptions and commit to growth. He stated that the purpose of confronting Jordan publicly had not been to destroy his career, but to create a teaching moment that might benefit Jordan and the millions of people who would see the exchange. Jordan used the talk show appearance to offer a more complete and articulate apology than he had been capable of delivering in the immediate aftermath of his offense. He thanked Steve for responding with measured discipline, rather than simply having him removed from the show, acknowledged that the public accountability had been difficult but necessary, and committed to using his platform as a comedian to model more thoughtful approaches to humor that did not require causing genuine harm to be effective. 1 year after the episode aired, Jordan had begun to build a different kind of comedy career than he had originally envisioned. His material had evolved to focus less on shock value and transgressive boundary pushing, and more on insightful observation and clever wordplay that generated laughter without relying on cruelty or disrespect. He developed a reputation among comedy bookers as someone who could be edgy without being harmful, who could challenge audiences without attacking vulnerable individuals. Jordan also began speaking at comedy workshops and training programs about his Family Feud experience and the lessons he had learned about the difference between bravery and cruelty in comedy. He shared his journey from believing that any topic was fair game for humor to understanding that context, power dynamics, and genuine consideration for impact had to inform comedic choices. His presentations helped emerging comedians navigate questions about boundaries that their training might not adequately address. 5 years later, the Family Feud incident had become a well-known case study in discussions about comedy ethics, the evolution of humor norms, and the responsibility that public figures have to defend family dignity while also allowing space for legitimate satire and social commentary. The clip was used in communication courses, ethics classes, and comedy training programs as an example of both what not to do and how to respond when boundaries are violated. Steve Harvey spoke occasionally about the incident in interviews and public appearances, using it as an illustration of principles he believed were important for everyone to understand regardless of their profession or platform. He emphasized that protecting family was not about being humorless or unable to take a joke, but about maintaining clear boundaries between legitimate subjects for public discourse and private matters that deserved protection from attack. During one interview 5 years after the incident, Steve reflected on whether his confrontation of Jordan had been the right approach. He acknowledged that some people believed he had overreacted and that his public calling out of Jordan had been unnecessarily harsh. But Steve maintained that the response had been proportionate to the offense and that allowing Jordan's comment to pass without direct confrontation would have sent a message that family was acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of humor. 10 years after the memorable Family Feud confrontation, a retrospective examination was published analyzing the long-term impact of the incident on comedy culture, public discourse about boundaries, and Steve Harvey's legacy as someone willing to use his platform to defend principles he believed mattered. The analysis documented measurable shifts in how comedy venues and training programs approach discussions of boundaries, with increased emphasis on understanding context and considering impact alongside intent. The retrospective included extensive interviews with Jordan Mitchell, now 38 years old, and an established comedian known for intelligent social commentary delivered through humor that challenged without requiring cruelty. Jordan reflected on how the single worst moment of his early career had ultimately become the catalyst for developing a comedic voice that was more sustainable, more respected, and more aligned with the person he wanted to be. In the retrospective's conclusion, both Steve Harvey and Jordan Mitchell offered final thoughts on what the incident had meant and what lessons it contained for broader questions about humor, respect, and the boundaries we maintain to protect what matters most. Their reflections demonstrated that difficult confrontations, handled with both firmness and possibility for redemption, could create value that extended far beyond the immediate moment of conflict. The story of Jordan Mitchell's inappropriate comment and Steve Harvey's measured but uncompromising response reminds us that family deserves protection from public attack, that humor has boundaries that should not be crossed regardless of claimed artistic intent, and that genuine accountability requires both clear consequences for violations and opportunity for learning and growth when people demonstrate willingness to change. If this story resonated with you and reminded you of the importance of defending family dignity and maintaining clear boundaries about what constitutes acceptable humor, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We share these powerful moments because they challenge us to think carefully about the difference between legitimate satire and cruel attacks disguised as comedy. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that intent does not erase impact, and that protecting the people we love from public mockery is not overreaction but necessary defense of what matters most. Remember that words have power, that humor can unite or divide, and that the choice of how to use that power reveals our character and our values.